Tom Homan just announced the end of the most controversial immigration enforcement operation in American history. After weeks of nationwide protests, 2 U.S. citizens killed by immigration officers, accusations of civil rights violations, and threats of government shutdown, Trump's border czar stood before reporters and declared Operation Metro Surge in Minnesota is over. But here's what makes this story absolutely explosive. Homan didn't just announce the operation was ending. He declared it a great success, despite 2 American citizens being shot dead by federal agents. He claimed over 4,000 undocumented immigrants were arrested, including violent criminals, and he credited unprecedented cooperation between federal agents and local law enforcement for the operation's achievements. Meanwhile, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz stood at his own press conference and said something completely different. He said the operation left Minnesota with deep damage, generational trauma, and economic ruin. He's proposing a $10 million emergency fund for small businesses financially destroyed by the surge. And he used the phrase cautiously optimistic, which is political speak for I don't trust anything these people are saying. 2 completely different versions of reality. 2 officials describing the same operation in ways that cannot both be true. One of them is lying. And what's at stake is nothing less than the future of immigration enforcement in America, and whether federal agents can operate in American cities with military-style tactics that result in American citizens being killed. This isn't just about Minnesota. This is about whether Trump's immigration crackdown will continue with the same aggressive tactics, or whether the backlash has forced a strategic retreat. This is about whether killing American citizens during immigration raids has consequences, or whether the administration can declare victory and move on. When you understand the full story of what happened in Minnesota, why it ended, and what comes next, you'll realize this is the most important immigration story of 2026, and it's not even close. Let me walk you through exactly what Operation Metro Surge was, what went wrong, and why Tom Homan's declaration of success is one of the most brazenly dishonest political statements you'll hear all year. Operation Metro Surge began in late January 2026 after President Trump ordered a massive escalation of immigration enforcement in Minneapolis. The operation was led initially by Greg Bovino, an ICE official who would later be sidelined after intense criticism of the operation's tactics. The stated goal was to arrest and deport undocumented immigrants with criminal records, particularly those convicted of violent crimes. Homan repeatedly emphasized that the operation was targeting dangerous criminals, not families, or people who had committed only civil immigration violations. But the reality on the ground in Minneapolis was very different from the official statements. Federal immigration agents, backed by National Guard troops, conducted raids across Minneapolis neighborhoods. They wore masks to conceal their identities. They conducted warrant-less searches. They operated with military-style tactics that terrified entire communities regardless of immigration status. And then 2 American citizens were killed, Renee and Alex Pretti, both U.S. citizens, both shot dead by immigration officers during the operation. The details of exactly how they died and whether the shootings were justified remain unclear because ICE has released limited information about the incidents. Think about that for a moment. Federal agents conducting immigration enforcement killed 2 American citizens in America in 2026. And the agency responsible has provided minimal public accounting of how it happened or whether anyone will be held accountable. The killings sparked nationwide protests. Demonstrations erupted not just in Minneapolis, but in cities across the country. Activists demanded answers. Civil rights organizations filed lawsuits. Democratic officials condemned the operation's tactics. And Trump's response was to send Tom Homan to Minneapolis to personally oversee the surge. Homan is Trump's border czar, a former ICE director, known for his aggressive approach to immigration enforcement. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't back down. He frames immigration enforcement as a war and immigrants as invaders. He's exactly the person you'd send if you wanted to double down on aggressive tactics rather than pull back. So Homan arrived in Minneapolis and took over the operation from Bovino, who was sidelined amid criticism about excessive force and civil rights violations. Homan's presence was supposed to signal that the operation would continue with even more intensity, but something changed. something that the official statements aren't fully explaining. Despite Homan's arrival, and despite Trump's public support for aggressive enforcement, Operation Metro Surge is now ending. Homan announced at a press conference that Trump approved his request to conclude the operation. He said he would stay in Minnesota a little longer to oversee the drawdown to ensure its success. Why? Why is the operation ending now? What changed between Homan arriving to escalate the operation and Homan announcing its conclusion? The official explanation is that the operation achieved its goals. Homan said Minnesota officials had been able to greatly reduce the number of targets for immigration enforcement. He claimed over 4,000 undocumented immigrants were arrested, including men convicted of rape and other sexual misconduct. But if the operation was so successful, why end it? Why not continue until every single target is apprehended? Why declare victory and withdraw when there are still undocumented immigrants with criminal records in Minnesota? The real answer is obvious to anyone paying attention. The operation became politically unsustainable. 2 dead American citizens, nationwide protests, accusations of civil rights violations, Republican senators like Rand Paul publicly questioning the tactics, a Democratic governor preparing to propose emergency funding for businesses damaged by the operation, and the very real possibility that continued operations would lead to more deaths and more protests. The Trump administration made a calculation. The political cost of continuing Operation Metro Surge exceeded the political benefit of aggressive immigration enforcement in Minneapolis. So they're ending it while claiming victory. But they can't admit that. Admitting the operation was ended because of political pressure would undermine the entire tough-on-immigration brand Trump has built. It would make the administration look weak and responsive to protests and criticism. So instead, they're framing it as a successful conclusion to a planned operation. Mission accomplished, targets arrested, time to move on. Governor Tim Walz isn't buying it for a second. At his own press conference following Homan's announcement, Walz said he was cautiously optimistic about the drawdown of federal agents. But then he immediately listed everything the operation destroyed. The fact of the matter is, they left us with deep damage, generational trauma. They left us with economic ruin in some cases. They left us with many unanswered questions. Deep damage, generational trauma, economic ruin, unanswered questions. That's not the language of someone who thinks the operation was a success. That's the language of someone who watched federal agents terrorize his state for weeks and is now left dealing with the consequences. Walz is proposing a $10 million emergency fund for small businesses who say they were financially hurt by the surge. Think about what that means. The federal immigration operation was so disruptive to the local economy that the state government needs to appropriate emergency funds to help businesses survive the damage. That's not a success. That's a disaster that required state taxpayer money to repair. Let's talk about the cooperation Homan keeps emphasizing, because this reveals something important about how the operation actually worked. Homan said the surge's end came after an unprecedented level of cooperation between federal agents and local law enforcement. He credited local officials for increasing their crackdown on protesters and local jails for being more willing to notify ICE of release dates for individuals they were seeking. Read that carefully. The cooperation Homan is praising includes local officials cracking down on protesters, not just maintaining public order, cracking down, treating protesters as public safety threats. This suggests that local law enforcement in Minnesota, which operates under Democratic Governor Tim Walz, was pressured or incentivized to suppress protests against federal immigration operations. That's a huge deal that deserves much more scrutiny than it's getting. Were Minneapolis police told to crack down harder on immigration protesters to appease federal officials? Were there threats of reduced federal funding or other consequences if local law enforcement didn't cooperate? What exactly was this unprecedented level of cooperation that Homan is celebrating? Homan also praised local jails for being more willing to notify ICE about release dates. This refers to detainer requests, where ICE asks local jails to hold undocumented immigrants beyond their scheduled release so ICE can take them into custody. Many Democratic-led jurisdictions refuse to honor these requests, arguing that local law enforcement shouldn't be doing federal immigration enforcement work. These are sanctuary city policies that Trump has condemned repeatedly. So Homan is essentially saying that the operation succeeded partly because Minnesota jails abandoned sanctuary-style policies and started cooperating with ICE. That's a significant shift that suggests either political pressure worked or that there were behind-the-scenes agreements we don't know about. Now let's talk about the 2 American citizens who were killed, because this is the story that's being buried under Homan's declarations of success. Renee Good and Alex Pretti, both shot by immigration officers during Operation Metro Surge, both U.S. citizens who should never have been targets of immigration enforcement in the first place. ICE Acting Director Todd Lyons testified at a congressional hearing that the agency launched 37 investigations for excessive use of force since January 2025, 37 investigations in 6 weeks. That's more than 1 investigation for excessive force every single day. And those are just the incidents serious enough to trigger investigations. How many more uses of force didn't meet the threshold for investigation, but still traumatized people and communities? Lyons was trying to demonstrate ICE accountability by citing these investigations. But what he actually revealed is that excessive force during immigration operations has become routine. Routine enough that there's an investigation opened every single day. The families of Renee Good and Alex Pretti deserve answers. They deserve to know exactly what happened. They deserve to know if the officers who killed their loved ones followed proper procedures or violated them. They deserve to know if anyone will be held accountable. So far, they haven't gotten those answers. And Homan's press conference declaring the operation a success didn't even mention their names. That tells you everything you need to know about how the administration views these deaths. Not as tragedies requiring investigation and accountability, not as warning signs that tactics need to change, as acceptable losses in a successful operation. Let's talk about the broader political context, because Operation Metro Surge didn't happen in isolation. Trump deployed National Guard troops to Minneapolis, along with Portland, Los Angeles, and Chicago. These cities all saw large protests against the presence of troops and immigration agents. The administration has now removed National Guard troops from Portland, Los Angeles, and Chicago, according to U.S. Northern Command. Notice the pattern. Deploy troops and agents. Face massive protests. Withdraw troops while claiming the operation achieved its goals. This happened in multiple cities following the same script. That's not a coincidence. That's a tested strategy. Go in hard with overwhelming force. Arrest as many people as possible. Then withdraw before the political backlash becomes unmanageable, while framing the withdrawal as a planned conclusion to a successful operation. The problem with this strategy is that it leaves devastation in its wake. Communities traumatized, businesses destroyed, American citizens killed, local governments forced to spend millions repairing the damage. And the immigration problem the operations were supposedly addressing remains fundamentally unchanged. There are still millions of undocumented immigrants in America. There are still hundreds of thousands with deportation orders. Arresting 4,000 people in Minnesota doesn't solve the underlying issue. Senator Rand Paul, a Republican, said something important at the congressional hearing. He said that reducing the federal presence in Minneapolis is a good sign and a good step forward. I'm glad that's happening. I think that is de-escalation. When a Republican senator is praising the de-escalation of immigration enforcement, you know the operation went too far. Rand Paul is not soft on immigration. He's a conservative who generally supports strict immigration enforcement. But even he recognized that what happened in Minneapolis crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed in a democracy. The fact that multiple Republican senators questioned the operation suggests there's genuine concern within the Republican Party about the tactics being used, not because they oppose immigration enforcement, but because they recognize that military-style operations in American cities that result in American citizens being killed create serious political and constitutional problems. Now let's talk about what's happening in Congress, because the fight over immigration enforcement has created a crisis that could shut down the government. The Senate failed on Thursday to advance a bill providing new funding for the Department of Homeland Security, which includes ICE. Earlier this month, lawmakers approved DHS funding for just 2 weeks with the plan to negotiate a substantive deal during that time. But there's no agreement. The Senate is going on break, and DHS could lose its funding starting Saturday. This would affect transportation security at airports, responses to disasters and emergencies, and a variety of other critical government functions. Though last year's legislation created separate funding that should allow ICE to continue operating even during a shutdown. Democrats are demanding changes to ICE operations in exchange for their support. They want agents to stop wearing masks so they can be identified. They want warrantless searches to end. They want accountability for excessive force. Republicans argue these demands would hamstring immigration enforcement and make it impossible for agents to do their jobs safely. Both sides are dug in. Neither is willing to compromise, and the result could be a partial government shutdown over immigration enforcement tactics. This is where Operation Metro Surge has brought us, to a place where the federal government might shut down because Democrats and Republicans cannot agree on basic parameters for how immigration agents should operate in American cities. Let's talk about the numbers Homan cited and why they require scrutiny. Homan said over 4,000 undocumented immigrants were arrested during Operation Metro Surge. He emphasized that many had convictions for rape and other serious crimes. But he didn't provide a detailed breakdown. How many of the 4,000 had violent criminal convictions? How many had only civil immigration violations or minor criminal records? How many American citizens were detained by mistake? ICE Acting Director Lyons testified that the agency is tracking roughly 1.6 million undocumented immigrants with deportation orders in the U.S. About 800,000 of those have criminal convictions. So even if every single one of the 4,000 people arrested in Minnesota had criminal convictions, which is extremely unlikely, that's still less than half of 1% of the total number of undocumented immigrants with criminal convictions nationwide. Operation Metro Surge arrested 4,000 people while traumatizing entire communities, killing 2 American citizens, sparking nationwide protests, and creating economic damage requiring state emergency funding. And it reduced the national problem by less than half of 1%. That's not success. That's an incredibly high cost for incredibly limited results. And the people who paid the highest cost weren't the undocumented immigrants with serious criminal convictions. They were the American citizens killed by federal agents, the legal immigrants too afraid to leave their homes, the small business owners who lost customers, and the communities left with generational trauma. Now let's talk about what this means for Trump's broader immigration agenda. Trump campaigned on the largest deportation operation in American history. He promised to remove millions of undocumented immigrants. He said he would use military assets if necessary. He presented immigration enforcement as a war that required wartime tactics. Operation Metro Surge was a test case for that vision. Overwhelming force, federal and military assets deployed together, aggressive tactics, including warrantless searches and masked agents, maximum arrests in minimum time. And it failed politically, not because it didn't result in arrests. It arrested thousands of people. It failed because the American people, including many Republicans, weren't willing to accept the tactics required to achieve those numbers. Killing American citizens is unacceptable. Terrorizing entire communities is unacceptable. Economic devastation is unacceptable. Agents wearing masks to avoid accountability is unacceptable. Even if you support strict immigration enforcement, even if you want undocumented immigrants deported, there are limits to what tactics are acceptable in a democracy. Operation Metro Surge found those limits, and the operation is ending because it crossed them. The question now is whether the Trump administration learned anything from Minnesota, or whether they'll try the same tactics in other cities and hope for different results. Governor Walz's phrase, cautiously optimistic, suggests he doesn't believe the administration has actually changed its approach. He thinks they're pulling back temporarily because of political pressure, but that the same tactics could return at any time. And he's probably right. Nothing in Homan's press conference suggested any acknowledgement that tactics need to change. No admission that killing American citizens is unacceptable. No commitment to warrant requirements or agent identification. just a declaration of success and a withdrawal that the administration frames as planned rather than forced. Let's talk about what Democrats are demanding in the funding negotiations, because their demands reveal what they think went wrong. Democrats want ICE agents to stop wearing masks. This seems like a small thing, but it's actually huge. When agents wear masks, they can't be identified. When they can't be identified, they can't be held accountable. Video of an excessive force incident means nothing if you can't identify which agent committed it. Requiring agents to be identifiable doesn't prevent them from doing their jobs. It just ensures accountability. The fact that ICE is fighting this requirement tells you they want the ability to operate without accountability. Democrats also want warrantless searches to end. Again, this doesn't prevent immigration enforcement. It just requires agents to get warrants from judges based on probable cause before searching homes and businesses. That's a basic constitutional requirement that applies to every other law enforcement activity in America. Immigration enforcement shouldn't be exempt from the Fourth Amendment. Democrats are also demanding that agents reveal their identities during operations. Not just avoid wearing masks, but actively identify themselves so people know who they're dealing with. These are not radical demands. These are basic accountability measures that apply to every other law enforcement agency. The fact that they're controversial for ICE tells you how far immigration enforcement has drifted from normal law enforcement standards. Republicans argue these requirements would make enforcement impossible, but that's not true. Every police department in America operates under these requirements. FBI agents operate under these requirements. Every federal law enforcement agency except ICE operates under these requirements. ICE can conduct immigration enforcement while following the Constitution and maintaining accountability. They just don't want to because it would make the job slightly harder and reduce the intimidation factor they rely on. Now let's talk about what happens next and why Minnesota might just be the beginning of a broader pullback. If Operation Metro Surge was as successful as Homan claims, we should expect to see similar operations in other cities with large undocumented populations. Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Phoenix, Houston. If the tactics work and the political cost is acceptable, why not deploy them everywhere? But I don't think we're going to see that. I think Minnesota taught the administration that aggressive immigration enforcement in American cities creates political problems that outweigh the benefits. The protests were massive and sustained. Democratic governors and mayors actively resisted. Republican senators expressed concern. 2 American citizens were killed, creating legal and political liability. And at the end of it all, they arrested 4,000 people while traumatizing communities and destroying businesses. That's not a formula the administration wants to repeat in every major city. The backlash would be overwhelming. The litigation would be endless. The political cost would be unsustainable. So instead, I expect we'll see a shift in strategy. Less focus on large-scale urban operations, more focus on border enforcement and targeting specific high-value individuals with serious criminal records. More cooperation with local law enforcement that's willing to help quietly. Less public military-style operations that generate media coverage and protests. That's not the mass deportation Trump promised during the campaign, but it might be the most he can actually achieve given the political and legal constraints he faces. Governor Walz said the operation left Minnesota with many unanswered questions. He's right. But the most important questions aren't just about Minnesota. The important questions are, can the federal government conduct immigration enforcement in American cities without violating constitutional rights? Can ICE operate with accountability and transparency, or does immigration enforcement require secrecy and unchecked power? Are American citizens safe from federal agents, or can anyone be detained, searched, or even killed if they're in the wrong place during an immigration operation? Operation Metro Surge didn't answer these questions. It raised them in the most dramatic way possible by killing 2 American citizens and traumatizing entire communities. Tom Homan declaring the operation a success doesn't make it one. Withdrawing federal agents doesn't undo the damage. And framing the withdrawal as a planned conclusion doesn't change the fact that it was forced by political reality. Minnesota showed us what Trump's immigration crackdown looks like when fully implemented. Federal and military assets deployed together, warrantless searches, masked agents, thousands of arrests, American citizens killed. And Minnesota showed us that America isn't willing to accept those tactics, not because Americans oppose immigration enforcement, but because Americans still believe in constitutional limits on government power and accountability for federal agents who kill citizens. The operation is over, the agents are leaving, but the damage remains, and the fundamental question of how immigration enforcement can be conducted in a democracy remains unanswered. Tom Homan can declare victory all he wants, but the families of Renee Good and Alex Pretti know the truth. 2 American citizens are dead, and nobody has been held accountable. That's not success, that's failure, on every level that matters.